Rules of War. Illegal Acts in Warfare. Far from the free-for-all many believe it to be, warfare is actually governed by extensive sets of rules, agreed upon by the international community, in order to limit the damage and suffering that inevitably follows a conflict. These rules cover many aspects of war, from the designation of non-combatants, the treatment of medics on the battlefield, and even the types of weapons that can be used, all in an attempt to mitigate the inevitable pain and misery warfare invariably generates. While codes of conduct have existed in militaries for centuries, it wasn't until 1863 when the first formal codification of war crimes was established. Known as the Lieber Code, after its author Francis Lieber, the document governed the conduct of Union soldiers during the American Civil War, prohibiting, quote, all wanton violence committed against persons in the invaded country, end quote. Using the code as a guideline, the international community would formally arrange the rules and conduct of war into several treaties, including the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention, among many others. These treaties outline the treatment of wounded soldiers and prisoners, the protection afforded to civilians and other non-combatants, and even the weapons that can be used. Over the years, these and other treaties would be updated and further codified, expanding the included safeguards. There is, however, no single code of conduct that governs all actions on the battlefield, and not all nations acknowledge the same treaties, or even have the same interpretation of the provisions of the treaties they signed. Generally, though, there are guidelines that are followed by the majority of nations on the planet. Invalid targets. The key principle of the laws of war attempt to mitigate suffering and minimize damage. A major part of this is designating those who are off-limits for military operations. Civilians. One of the main points outlined in the various rules of conduct on the battlefield designates legitimate targets from non-combatants. Civilians not actively participating in the conflict are given full protection under international law. Violations of these safeguards include directly attacking civilians, wanton destruction of civilian areas, the deportation of civilians from captured regions, subjecting civilians to unnecessary, dangerous, or experimental medical procedures, and using those in occupied areas for forced labor. In addition to these non-combatants themselves, public buildings are also off-limits for attack. These include, but are not limited to, schools, hospitals, museums, religious buildings, historic sites and monuments, among many others. Power stations, water treatment plants, and other forms of necessary infrastructure are also off-limits for attack. In addition to these, the private property of civilians is also to be respected wherever possible. Looting, plundering, stealing, or any other form of theft is also forbidden. Weapons and other military hardware can be seized during wartime, but other objects that are not military in nature should not be touched. These types of structures are strictly off-limits unless their destruction is absolutely necessary for a military objective. For example, a museum is considered a protected location, and attacking it a war crime. Though if the building is fortified, storing weapons, or in any way contributing to the war effort, it becomes a legitimate target and can be destroyed in the same way as any other military installation. Journalists and reporters in war zones are also to be considered civilians and afforded the same protection as civilians elsewhere, provided they don't take part in any actual fighting or participate in any other way, such as through espionage. Medical personnel and clergy. One of the most extensive series of protections outlined by international law are the ones regarding the safety of medical personnel. Under most treaties, medical personnel performing their duties are to be considered non-combatants and afforded full protection under law. Doctors, nurses, stretcher bearers, and those who transport the wounded are not to be targeted at any time. Likewise, hospitals, aid stations, and any location designated for the treatment of wounded individuals are also given the same protection. These areas, as well as transport vehicles such as helicopters, ambulances, and others, should be marked with a distinguishing feature, usually a red cross on a white background, denoting it as being used for medical and not military purposes. Deliberately attacking a vehicle marked in that way is a war crime and can be prosecuted as such. The situation is somewhat more flexible in regard to combat medics. Most treaties and laws stipulate that medics on the battlefield are granted the same protection as any other medical personnel. In most cases, though, they're also permitted to carry weapons. This allows them to protect themselves and their patients from deliberate attacks which are in violation of international law. The exact type of weapons permitted varies from military to military, but generally speaking, those designed for personal use are allowed, such as rifles and pistols, though anything that has a greater destructive potential, such as a rocket launcher or mortar, are not allowed. In practice, if a medic is treating a wounded soldier and an enemy combatant attempts to finish off the casualty, the medic is allowed to eliminate this threat while still retaining his status as a non-combatant. Likewise, he's allowed to defend himself and his patients from marauders that may be roaming the battlefield looking for dead and injured soldiers to rob. Should the medic participate in a direct action against the enemy though, such as providing covering fire for his comrades, he would automatically lose his protected status and would be treated the same way as any other soldier. During many conflicts, such as the First and Second World Wars, medics operating on the battlefield did not carry weapons, which helped to avoid confusion in the chaos of a combat environment. If someone is not carrying a weapon, it's highly likely that this individual is a medic, and those who respected international laws would not shoot them. Though not medical personnel, clergy and those designated to tend to the spiritual needs of soldiers are also given similar protection. At Simple History, we've been working with talented artists on something truly special, a collection of official, premium wall art that captures history's most incredible characters. These aren't just amazing pieces of art, they're timeless treasures designed to inspire and spark conversations for years to come. As a thanks to you, our amazing Simple History community, we're offering an exclusive 25% off these prints. Unlike fleeting trends or short-lived crazes, these prints are designed to be timeless, a lasting treasure you'll proudly display for years to come. They're perfect for any space. Imagine them on the walls of a classroom where they'll inspire students and spark meaningful discussions. Or picture them in your home or office where they'll show off your love of history with sophistication. Don't miss your chance to own one. Click the link in the description below now. Other non-combatants. As a general rule, only those in uniform capable of participating in the fighting are allowed to be targeted, while those who are incapable of resistance are to be considered non-combatants. These include prisoners or any soldier who lays down his weapons, those who are wounded and unable to resist, those shipwrecked at sea, air crews parachuting to the ground, etc. These are generally known as persons hors de combat. While they are in such a vulnerable state, these individuals are not a threat, and attacking them would constitute a war crime. Should conditions permit, they should be taken into custody and treated as prisoners of war, and given all the protection that is given by that. However, should these seemingly vulnerable individuals resist, they would automatically become a legitimate target. For example, if a wounded soldier continues to shoot at the enemy, he is simply another enemy combatant and can be treated as such. In a similar fashion, a parachuting air crew that uses their service weapons to shoot at the enemy as they descend forfeit their protection and can receive return fire. Faking surrender and perfidy. Faking a surrender or wound in order to deceive the enemy is forbidden. Should a soldier pretend to surrender only then to turn on their enemy is considered a war crime, which can be prosecuted as such. This is not only illegal, but it would be frowned upon by the comrades of the individual who attempts it, as it also puts their lives into jeopardy. Doing so invalidates surrender as an option, as the survivors of such an act will be less likely to honor any future legitimate attempts to surrender. Perfidy, or leading the enemy into believing that they're under the protection of international law only to break that confidence, is strictly banned. An example of this would be encouraging an enemy to surrender only to shoot them once they give up their weapons, or breaking the truce once they let their guard down. Uniforms, espionage, and symbols. Those who participate in combat are granted protection under the Geneva Convention and other treaties, but must wear something to designate themselves as such. A uniform issued by the military is sufficient for this purpose. Likewise, militia, resistance movements, and other informal organizations are also granted the same protections, but these individuals usually lack standard issue uniforms and have to wear some designating symbol to mark themselves as a legitimate combatant. These don't have to be elaborate. Even something as simple as a colored armband is sufficient for this purpose. Any combatants who don't wear distinguishing markings are not covered by the laws that provide protection for legitimate soldiers. Spies who operate while wearing civilian clothing or the clothing of the enemy are not considered legitimate combatants and are not afforded the same protections. If captured, any laws regarding the treatment of captured soldiers are not applicable. These individuals are given the right to a fair trial before any punitive actions, but they can be subject to punishments not metered out to most soldiers, and normally resulting with the death penalty. Should a soldier remove his uniform to don enemy or civilian clothing, any protection granted to them would be forfeited, and the individual would be considered a spy and treated accordingly. This rule also covers the use of other symbols and uniforms that may grant special protections. The use of UN, Red Cross, or other symbols, or that of a neutral nation to deceive the enemy is also prohibited. Child soldiers. One of the most tragic aspects of warfare is the use of the very young on the front lines. Multiple treaties address this issue, banning the use of children as soldiers under any circumstance from participating in warfare, including espionage, acting as couriers, or as guides of other military forces. Different treaties limit the age of combatants, with some placing the youngest at 15, while others raise the limit to 18 years of age. Should a child be caught up in the fighting or live in an area under enemy occupation, any punishment, regardless of the crime, cannot include the death penalty. Under the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, execution of an individual under the age of 18 at the time of the alleged crime is expressly forbidden. Other illegal actions. A number of actions that can occur in war are strictly prohibited. These include hostage-taking, use of human shields, killing of hostages, torture, the deliberate killing of prisoners, intentionally starving prisoners or others under a military's care, as well as the use of starvation as a weapon against civilian populations. There are also rules relating to any persecution against political, ethnic, religious, or racial groups. The overall intention of international treaties is to minimize the suffering and bloodshed, especially among those that are not taking part in the fighting. Using hostages or human shields deliberately places these protected individuals in harm's way, which can only serve to increase unnecessary carnage. For similar reasons, torture is also prohibited. Corporal punishments for crimes committed are also illegal, as well as collective punishments. There are also very strong provisions against attempted genocide. Throughout the 20th century, many attempts have been made to wipe out groups due to their ethnic, religious, political, or other affiliations. These actions and others do nothing to further legitimate military aims and only increase the experienced suffering unnecessarily. Banned weapons. Limiting undue suffering is a key component of the laws regarding warfare. Any weapon that's designed to cause unnecessary misery or distress, or is designed to kill in an inhumane way, is banned for use by international law. Chemical weapons and poisons. The use of chemical weapons in warfare is banned, as these cause unnecessary suffering. In order to prevent the horrors experienced in the First World War, the use of mustard and chlorine gas is strictly prohibited, as are other lethal chemicals such as VX nerve gas, sarin, and others. Even non-lethal types of gas are banned from use in warfare. Tear gas, commonly used domestically for riot control as an irritant, which causes difficulty breathing and eye irritation but is not lethal, is prohibited in warfare. Poisons are also strictly prohibited, so contaminating food or water supplies is completely banned by international law. Poisoned bullets or other munitions that carry a toxic agent are also forbidden. Biological agents. The use of bacteria, viruses, or other disease-causing agents is prohibited by international law. Not only does this cause unnecessary suffering, which can vary greatly depending on the type of disease employed, but it is difficult, if not impossible, to control. One of the main factors in the rules of warfare is to limit indiscriminate destruction and loss of life. Most weapons have a foreseeable area of effect. Diseases, however, are not nearly as predictable. Contagious diseases can spread rapidly to non-combatants, which can even spread to non-affiliated nations, such as neutral countries bordering the conflict zone. Landmines. No other weapon has caused as much controversy than landmines. The main reason for the prohibition of these weapons is their indiscriminate nature. Once buried, they can remain dormant for years, only to be triggered by a hapless individual well after the end of any conflict. Over the decades, multiple treaties have been signed by nations around the world prohibiting or limiting their use. Some countries place an outright ban on their usage, while some only prohibit anti-personnel mines, which are designed to maim rather than kill. If landmines are deployed, there are multiple restrictions on their usage. They must be kept away from areas traveled by civilians as much as possible, and clearly marked to prevent a non-combatant from stumbling into a minefield by mistake. At the end of the conflict, the mines must either be recovered or destroyed in order to prevent risks to civilians long after the conflict is over. Many mines can be equipped with a timer, setting them to detonate after a certain time period in order to avoid remaining in the ground for potentially years. Plastic landmines, which are much harder to detect and remove compared to their metal counterparts, are prohibited from use. Like other landmines, they can remain inactive for many years after the end of a conflict, but are much harder to find and deactivate, making them an even greater threat than the conventional metal ones. International law does not cover the use of remotely detonated mines, so long as they're recovered at the end of the conflict and are not employed in civilian areas. Lasers. Any weapon that is intended to cause permanent paralysis or injury is banned from warfare. Lasers or any other tool designed to deliberately cause blindness is prohibited from use as a weapon. It's important to note that this ban only applies to lasers designed and intended to cause eye damage in the enemy. Lasers are commonly used by militaries around the world as targeting devices for signaling and communications, and other tasks, all of which are legitimate. Should an enemy combatant be blinded by mistake during the use of one of these tools, that is not to be considered a war crime, rather an unfortunate accident. Expanding and exploding bullets. The use of bullets that are designed to either expand or flatten upon impact with the human body are prohibited from use in warfare. Most commonly in the form of hollow points. These were first banned in the Hague Convention of 1899. Designated originally as dum-dum bullets, these munitions were believed to have caused unnecessary suffering and are not allowed for use on the battlefield. Incidentally, the United States, while a signatory of the Hague Convention, maintains the use of expanding ammunition is legal if there is a, quote, clear showing of military necessity for its use, end quote. In spite of this, the United States did not contest the illegal ruling of this type of ammunition during negotiations in the international courts in 1998, and does not supply such munitions to its soldiers. Similarly, exploding bullets are also banned from use in warfare. As a general rule, any projectile that is designed to explode upon contact with human flesh will cause unnecessary suffering to the victim. This particular rule is somewhat ambiguous, as hand grenades, anti-aircraft shells, and other small explosive projectiles are commonly in use by most militaries without any objection by the international community. In practice, the crime is the deliberate use of such a device against humans. Employing explosive rounds for anti-vehicle purposes is acceptable, but deliberately targeting humans is a crime under international law. Non-detectable fragments. Explosive shells, mines, or other devices that produce non-detectable fragments are banned for use in warfare. Many anti-personnel devices rely on fragmentation for their effectiveness, usually made out of easily detectable metal particles, which can be picked up on X-ray and other medical devices, allowing doctors to take the appropriate steps to treat a wounded soldier. Some munitions employ the use of glass, plastic, or other material that's difficult to detect by doctors, who often have to resort to finding the fragments manually, causing additional pain and medical complications. These weapons serve no military purpose and only increase the suffering of those unfortunate enough to be affected by such a device. As such, these weapons are prohibited by multiple treaties. Flamethrowers and flame weapons. Two of the most iconic weapons in use during the 20th century are flamethrowers and napalm, incendiary devices that set fire to everything around them. These weapons are legal to use, though with many restrictions. Incendiary devices are prohibited for use in areas occupied or frequented by civilians. Should such a weapon be employed, every measure must be taken to ensure the fire does not spread into civilian areas. Incendiary weapons can be used against combatants, but only if there are no other ways to eliminate the enemy with less harmful methods. In modern-day conflicts, with much of the fighting taking place in urban areas, this is often difficult, and many militaries simply forego their use altogether. Flamethrowers and napalm can be used to clear foliage and other vegetation, but only if it serves a military purpose and is well away from civilian areas. Cluster bombs. Cluster bombs, also known as cluster munitions, are banned for use by over 100 countries around the world. These munitions consist of a single bomb or shell that deploys smaller munitions called bomblets that can spread out over a large area. Cluster bombs are difficult to control and can cover a large area, causing indiscriminate destruction, which is at odds with the intent of international law limiting devastation. Furthermore, these bomblets are unreliable, with estimates placing the failure rate at between 10 to 40%. This leaves unexploded ordnance spread over a large area, posing a risk to civilians even years after the conflict. Recently, the United States has agreed to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions, an act that has caused controversy among the international community, including NATO allies such as Germany and the UK, who have fully outlawed their use. There are a myriad of other laws that govern the conduct of soldiers on the battlefield. As the nature of war is constantly evolving, these laws will evolve as well. The nations of the world will be compelled to create a new, updated set of rules on warfare and reinterpret existing statutes in order to protect those caught up in the sheer destruction that combat inevitably leaves behind.
The World War I Crucifixion, 1915. World War I ran from 1914 to 1918 and was one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. It was also one of the most brutal, employing the very latest high-tech weapons capable of lethal destruction, such as tanks, deadly poison gas, rapid-firing machine guns that could fire as many as 10 rounds per second, and giant railway guns that could fire a 2-ton shell over a distance of more than 10 miles. Also, for the very first time ever, there were massive aerial dogfights that took place thousands of feet above the ground, in flimsy planes made of just canvas and wood. If they got shot down, the pilots faced certain death as parachutes were not yet standard issue at this time. The war on the Western Front quickly descended into harsh and brutal trench warfare. This started a devastating cycle of death and destruction, resulting in a seemingly never-ending series of attack and counterattack across no man's land by both sides. This always seemed to achieve very little until this vicious stalemate was finally broken in 1918, when the Allies broke through the German lines and quickly brought the war to an end. Early on in the conflict, facts, hearsay, and propaganda started to get mixed up together on both the front line and the home fronts. For instance, right at the beginning of the war, there emerged fantasy accounts of supernatural angels or phantom bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt of 1415, supposedly protecting the British Army from defeat at the Battle of Mons that took place in Belgium around August 23, 1914. Nevertheless, despite being untrue, this was used as great propaganda by the British, claiming that it clearly showed that God was on their side against the evil of the Imperial German Empire. Then, a short time later, amid all the chaos of combat on the Western Front, stories started to emerge of the inhumane treatment of a captured Canadian soldier. These stories both shocked and angered the Allied forces and public alike. It concerned the supposed crucifixion of a Canadian prisoner at the hands of his German captors. The rumors surrounding this gruesome event were vague, and the details kept changing, depending on where and from who you heard it from. Nevertheless, a horrifying account of this event was featured on the highly respected British Times newspaper on May 10, 1915. It was claimed that a captured Canadian officer near the battlefield of Ypres in Belgium was crucified with bayonets by the Germans. It was said that they used them to pin him against a barn door or tree, one in each arm and leg, and that he was finished off by having a final bayonet driven through his throat. It was also alleged that the Germans finally riddled his body with bullets. This atrocity caused such an outcry among the British public that 2 days later questions were asked about it in the Houses of Parliament, and it was now thought the actual number of Canadian prisoners that were crucified could be as high as 3. The British government responded by stating that at the present time they had no information about these atrocities, but promised that the War Office would look into these claims as a matter of urgency. Meanwhile, the Times published a follow-up article claiming they had witnesses to the event, and the man who was crucified was in fact an unnamed sergeant in the Canadian Army. Then, on May 19th in the Houses of Parliament, the Conservative MP Sir Robert Houston raised further concerns surrounding this supposed crucifixion of a captured Canadian soldier. He declared he had come across more detailed information about the incident. He said he had heard from unnamed witnesses that the unnamed sergeant was the only survivor of 40 captured wounded Canadian soldiers who were bayoneted to death in a barn by the Germans. The Canadian sergeant was then tied to the village's large public crucifix, having first removed the figure of Christ from it. It was then alleged that he too was bayoneted to death. Another version stated that the victim was identified as Sergeant Thomas Elliott of the Canadian Medical Service, who came from Brantford in Ontario, Canada, but he later wrote to his pastor saying that he was definitely not the man involved. The British Undersecretary of State for War responded by making it clear all alleged war crimes were taken seriously and thoroughly investigated, adding that this particular incident had yet to be authenticated and that inquiries were still going on. There emerged several other versions of the same story, some saying the soldier was in fact British, and some said he was nailed or fastened to the side of the barn or to a tree. At this time, Allied soldiers would have also witnessed something quite barbaric behind their own lines. After flogging was abolished in the British Army in 1881, an alternative was introduced and known as Field Punishment No. 1. This was awarded for drunkenness in the field and insubordination, and involved being tied to a wagon wheel or a gate in the crucifixion pose. The victim would be shackled like this for 2 hours a day for up to 3 out of 4 days of his sentence. In total, the British Army carried out this punishment 60,120 times during World War I. Though the story of the crucifixion was never substantiated, it was nevertheless used by the British for propaganda purposes and to get support from across the world.
The U.S. authorities even used the gruesome tale to sell its Liberty War bonds. After the war, the myth continued. In 1918, a 32-inch high or 810mm bronze sculpture was created by Francis Derwent Wood. It was named Canada's Golgotha and depicted the same supposed crucifixion of a Canadian soldier nailed to a barn door at the hands of his German captors, who jeer at him. The sculpture was to be revealed in January 1919 at an exhibition at Burlington House, London. In fact, before the statue was even on show, the public were aware of it. It had been widely publicized, having been featured in a publicity package sent out by the Canadian War Records Office. The Daily Mail newspaper captioned it, "Canada's sternest memorial to her sons, suffering in the war." All of this was during the same month as the Paris Peace Conference and the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty. The crucified soldier sculpture was going to cause a stir for those at the Versailles Conference and for those seeking a peaceful solution. Canadian Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden led an investigation into the war crime story. The German government at the same time demanded that the Canadians publicly admit that the story of the crucified soldier was untrue or provide evidence. The Canadian government believed that they had 2 accounts to verify the story, one of those being from a victim called Sergeant Brandt. The crucified soldier sculpture was withdrawn from the exhibition, however, when the Germans demanded to take part in the investigation. Being investigated by the losers of the war must have caused a lot of embarrassment for the Canadian government. The sculpture would never be shown again until the 1990s. After taking the sculpture down in 1919, Canadians continued to look into the story but could not find any proof that it had happened. The Nazis would use the crucified soldier years later as an example of Britain and its Commonwealth's propaganda.
Horrifying military medical experiments. Although the military is loath to admit it, they have been at the forefront of some of the worst and most unethical human experimentation in history. A lot of this has been covered up and expunged, but multiple militaries across the world, sanctioned by their own governments, have performed some truly heinous acts against other human beings. Nazi Germany's Josef Mengele. During World War II in the Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz in Poland, there was a Nazi doctor who performed horrifying experiments on the Jewish prisoners. His name was Dr. Josef Mengele, but he was better known as the Angel of Death. Mengele's particular obsession was performing experiments on twins. Everything he did was performed on unwilling and unable to consent participants and was 100% unethical and deeply disturbing. The exact number of his victims is unknown, and to this day believed to be underestimated. As well as his propensity for twins, Mengele performed most of his experiments on children, targeting Jewish and Roma children in particular, many of whom did not survive their treatment. But some of those who did spoke out about what they had experienced, one of whom was a twin named Eva Moses Kor, who was just 9 when she and her twin sister were separated from their family and sent to Mengele at Auschwitz. Once there, the twins were stripped, their hair shaved, and they were tattooed with registration numbers. Even at Auschwitz, Mengele's work was top secret, and they were completely separated from the other prisoners. Eva spoke about the other twins she saw and the horrifying fates they suffered. According to her account, Mengele's research could be split into 2 parts, genetics and germ warfare. For the germ research, he would inject one twin with a deadly disease and monitor its progression. If the child died, their twin would be killed so they could both be autopsied, or more accurately, dissected, and the results compared. Other experiments included cross-transfusions of blood and multiple experiments on their lower bodies and organs, such as connecting a urinary tract of one young girl to her colon. One of Mengele's most horrific experiments was his attempt to make his own version of Siamese twins by connecting 2 victims' internal organs to each other. As well as Eva, there are many accounts from other survivors, and the breadth and depth of Mengele's experiments are too extensive to mention them all. Another child, Ephraim Reichenberg, who was 17 at the time, was mistaken for a twin with his older brother and spoke of experiments performed on their vocal cords by Mengele and his team. And Jonah Laux, who spoke of painful injections she suffered to her spine as well as being operated on by Mengele. According to Laux, his research would be sent to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where he would, disgustingly, be paid well for these reports. These are just a few of the horrific reports of what the poor children of Auschwitz experienced under Mengele's orders. But Josef Mengele was not the only Nazi to perform unethical medical experiments. Others included Klaus Schilling and George Schaltenbrand, and their research was widespread and varied, including atrocities like forced eugenic sterilization and castration. Men like Schilling were thankfully brought to court at the Nuremberg trials after the war, although, incredibly, he asked to continue his experiments in volunteers. But Mengele fled, escaping the Allied forces. And so, he will forever remain in history as the Angel of Death, the Nazi doctor who was never brought to justice. Unit 731 and Biological Warfare. Unit 731 was a secret division of the Japanese military stationed in Manchuria during the 1930s and 40s. The unit performed human experimentation and tested acts of biological warfare on prisoners and civilians. It was commanded by a man named Ishii Shiro, who used his position to encourage military interest in biological warfare. When the war ended, most of the documentation on the unit was destroyed, and the true horrors of the experiments conducted only properly started to emerge decades later. But it's believed that thousands upon thousands lost their lives in Unit 731 in the name of advancing biological warfare. Largely, the unit used Chinese citizens as their guinea pigs, and like Mengele, those who succumbed under the studies had their bodies dissected and autopsied to analyze the effects of their experiments. What occurred at Unit 731 includes some of the worst atrocities in history. These are just some of the things we know took place. Live dissection of victims without any anesthesia, intentional infection with a plethora of diseases, including the plague, cholera, and tuberculosis, death by experimental weapons like high-altitude bombs, intended to be filled with deadly gases like anthrax and clouds that disperse lethal bacteria, and intentional exposure to frostbite. Famously, it is the last experiment that has actually proven to be useful in the medical community. As Ishii's team discovered, the best treatment for frozen limbs is to soak them in water at 37 degrees Celsius. To discover this, however, he repeatedly froze and defrosted human beings, making the price for the knowledge far too high. The work Unit 731 did was dehumanizing, and it's clear that they did not see their subjects as human at all. In fact, historian Sheldon Harris claimed they referred to their subjects as monkeys or Manchurian monkeys and other similar animal names. Few survived the horrors of the research program. Even now, Unit 731 remains relatively unknown. Unlike the experiments of the Nazis, which were exposed after the war, the unit in Japan did not receive the same treatment. Incredibly, a lot of the Japanese researchers escaped punishment altogether, including General Ishii Shiro, who received immunity from prosecution for himself and his men. In fact, horrifyingly, a lot was done to cover up the truth of what had happened there, in no small part thanks to the US, who expunged a lot of documentation in exchange for receiving the results of some of the medical experimentation that took place. To this day, it's unknown just what research the US claimed from the Japanese as part of this agreement. U.S. experimentation during the Cold War. On September 28, 1994, the United States General Accounting Office released a report written by the Assistant Comptroller General, Frank C. Conahan, that revealed some of the dark and disturbing experiments performed by the U.S. military during the Cold War. The report found that the Department of Defense and other national security agencies were responsible for the undertaking of extensive radiological, chemical, and biological research programs. Many of the experiments had their true purposes concealed, and as a result, the hundreds of thousands who took part in them were unable to give fully informed consent. They suffered injuries, health issues, and some even died. The scope of the experiments is also deeply horrifying. Over 200 radiation tests had been performed on over 210,000 participants, and a further 199,000 were exposed. In other studies, chemical tests were sent out to universities, hospitals, and research facilities to be used on uninformed healthy adults, psychiatric patients, and prisoners alike. Records show that this included the testing of chemical weaponry like mustard agents, the catalysts of the deadly mustard gas bombs used in the previous world wars. Beyond that, participants were also exposed to nerve agents and their antidotes, given psychochemicals to analyze their effects, and trialed the effects of long-term LSD use. Some of these tests were conducted by the CIA, and not the military specifically, including the more renowned MK-Ultra project where the LSD testing took place. However, it is clear that the government as a whole was involved in these experiments during the Cold War, and the military certainly played a part. There are plenty of other experiments and atrocities humanity has wrought on each other across the centuries, but those conducted by military officials like Mengele, Ishii, and the US government in times of war are particularly disturbing.
Hugh Thompson, the hero of My Lai. Perhaps the most disgraceful event ever in U.S. military history was the My Lai Massacre, where hundreds of unarmed civilians were killed by American soldiers. There was at least one American, however, who followed his conscience, and together with his two crewmates, prevented even more killings in this horrific incident. Hugh Clowers Thompson Jr. was born on April 14, 1943 in Atlanta, Georgia. His childhood was uneventful, and he attended Troy State University, though he dropped out before graduating. He then joined the Navy in 1961, where he was a Seabee until he left in 1964. Throughout his life, Thompson was fascinated by flying, and in 1966 he joined the U.S. Army, becoming qualified as a helicopter pilot. In 1967 he was sent to Vietnam, where he flew an OH-23 Raven reconnaissance helicopter. He was promoted to warrant officer and assigned to the 123rd Aviation Battalion, attached to the 23rd Infantry Division, which was known as the Americal Division. In March 1968, he, along with his crew chief Glenn Andreatta and Lawrence Colburn, who both acted as door gunners, were part of B Company Aero Scouts, aka the Warlords. On March 16th, Thompson and his crew were flying in support of Task Force Barker, near the village of My Lai, located along the south coast of Vietnam. By this point in the war, the U.S. had just fought off the Tet Offensive, And though militarily it was a failure for the NVA and Viet Cong, who suffered devastating losses, it was a massive blow to American morale. Civilians back home, as well as troops in the field, were increasingly frustrated with the lack of any real progress being made in the war, which seemed to drag on without an end in sight. And the burgeoning anti-war movement was growing with each passing day. For over a month before My Lai, 3 companies of the 11th Infantry Brigade were searching for the 48th Viet Cong Battalion on a seek and destroy mission. Because there were no front lines in the conflict, success was measured by body count, tallies of the number of enemy killed and wounded. Officers and soldiers were pressured to increase their body counts, forcing them to take more and more drastic measures. Operating around the village of My Lai, the Americans were floundering in their objective of rooting out the VC, being continually harassed by the enemy, and were taking ever-mounting casualties. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, the men would be subject to mines, which killed or disabled 32 men. A few days later, one of the companies was hit by a mortar attack, and just days before the massacre, 4 men were killed by a booby trap. After about a month of patrolling in the region, C Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, had endured 42 casualties and had hardly even seen the enemy, let alone engage them. With frustrations at a boiling point, the Americans lashed out and began a systematic massacre of the villagers, whom they suspected of being Viet Cong sympathizers. Grenades were tossed into huts, unarmed civilians were butchered without hesitation, and anyone who fled was shot without mercy. The survivors were herded to a nearby drainage ditch where they were shot, and anyone who still moved was bayoneted. Hugh Thompson and his crew were flying in support of the operation, and early that morning had spotted 2 Vietnamese men, whom he suspected were VC. Landing, he managed to capture them, and they were sent off for interrogation. On the ground, he noticed a group of civilians who were wounded and marked the spot with green smoke to signal that they needed help. After refueling back at base, he returned to the area and was horrified to find that the location he had marked earlier was now filled with corpses. At first, Thompson and his crew had thought that the dead had been caught in the open by an artillery barrage and killed accidentally. Moving on from that horrific sight, Thompson noticed another wounded Vietnamese woman, again marking the site for medevac. He became sickened to see American soldiers attracted by the smoke finish off the wounded civilian. It was at this moment when he realized what was happening. In a 2000 interview, Thompson stated, quote, "We started noticing these large numbers of bodies everywhere, people on the road dead, wounded, and just sitting there saying, God, how'd this happen? What's going on? And we started thinking what might have happened, but you didn't want to accept that. Because if you accepted it, that means your own fellow Americans, people you were there to protect, were doing something very evil." End quote. Thompson landed next to the ditch, where he had an altercation with Lieutenant William Calley, the main instigator of the massacre. Thompson took to the air again and was horrified by seeing Calley and his men finishing off the survivors in the ditch. At that moment, to the northeastern portion of the village, Thompson saw a group of about 10 Vietnamese civilians fleeing towards a homemade bomb shelter, with a platoon of Americans in pursuit. Knowing he had to do something to prevent more bloodshed, he acted quickly and decisively. Landing between the civilians and the Americans, he shouted for Andronetta and Colburn to cover him, and that if the Americans opened fire on him or the civilians, to return fire. Under the cover of his crew's M60 machine guns, he confronted Stephen Brooks, leader of 2nd Platoon. An argument began between the men, Thompson attempting to prevent more killings, with Brooks insistent that the Vietnamese be finished off with a grenade thrown into the bunker. Eventually, Brooks backed down, and Thompson was able to convince the Vietnamese to leave the bunker. Thompson would then signal to his 2 circling escort Huey helicopters to land and evacuate the civilians, taking them to a safe location. Once again returning from base to refuel, Andronetta saw movement in the drainage ditch. Thompson landed his OH-23, and he and his crew searched through the corpses until Andronetta found a young boy who had survived the massacre. Taking him on board, Thompson flew him to an ARV and hospital for treatment. Upon returning to base, Thompson immediately reported what he had seen to his superiors. News of the incident reached Lieutenant Colonel Frank Baker, the overall commander of the operation, and the order was given that led to the cessation of military activities in the area. Thompson was then interviewed by the commander of the 11th Infantry Brigade, who canceled further operations in the region, potentially preventing further killings. Initially, the Army tried to cover up the My Lai massacre, reporting that the operation in the region was a great success and that many Viet Cong guerrillas had been eliminated. Eventually, though, the truth of what happened was revealed, and a congressional inquiry into the events of My Lai began. Thompson testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, which launched an investigation into the massacre. Initially, some of the committee members wanted to punish Thompson for turning his weapons on fellow Americans, but no charges were ever brought. 14 officers would be court-martialed for their participation in either the massacre or the following cover-up, but only one, Lieutenant William Calley, would be found guilty. Thompson testified at Calley's trial, for which he received death threats. Thompson would continue to fly for the Army, eventually becoming an instructor. He would leave in 1983 with the rank of major. It wasn't until 1998 when he would be officially recognized for his actions. Hugh Thompson, as well as Lawrence Colburn, would be awarded the Soldier's Medal, the highest award the military can bestow for heroism not involving conflict with an enemy, and is on a roughly comparable status to a Distinguished Flying Cross. Glenn Andreatta would also be awarded the Soldier's Medal posthumously, having been killed in action 3 weeks after the My Lai incident. The My Lai massacre is one of the most shameful events in U.S. military history, and it was a major contributing factor in the disillusionment with the conflict. This and other atrocities fed into the ever-growing anti-war movement, which were a contributing factor in the American withdrawal from the conflict. Thompson would pass away in 2006 at the age of 62 from cancer and would be buried with full military honors. Today, there's a small museum in My Lai where Thompson is honored for his role in stopping the killings. There's also a list of those killed on that horrible day. There is some dispute over the exact number, with American sources claiming that 347 were killed, and the Vietnamese placing the total at over 500. What is not in dispute is the fact that the actions of Hugh Thompson and his crew kept the number from being even higher. Why do Canadians go ballistic in war? Ah, Canadians. We all know the stereotype. Nice, friendly, and extremely apologetic. If you're fighting them, though, avoid them at all costs, because for some strange reason, these usually calm maple leaf lovers go absolutely ballistic when there's a war on. Trench raids. In World War I, the only thing scarier than going on a trench raid was to be on the receiving end of a Canadian one. Soon after their deployment, the Canucks earned a fearsome reputation as enthusiastic and innovative practitioners of this brutal art. To maximize stealth, they were known to blacken their faces and to wear thick rubber gloves. They also brought along with them a variety of handmade weapons to optimize their killing effectiveness, such as spiked clubs, knives, and brass knuckles, to allow them to take out enemies silently. Alternatively, pipe bombs and grenade catapults were used if they preferred to go in guns blazing. On operation, the Canadians tore through trenches so quickly and with such cold-blooded efficiency that by the end of the war, they were able to reach up to 1 kilometer behind enemy lines. Their speed and ferocity earned them the nicknames from the terrified Germans, ranging from stormtroopers to wild colonials. The savage determination of the Canadians was most on show in the 4 months leading up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where they conducted 55 raids. The most disastrous of these happened in March of 1917, involving over 1,300 soldiers. Despite suffering an appalling 43% casualty rate and being constantly gassed, one group of raiders was able to clear a 450-meter section of the German trench. Killing prisoners of war. When they weren't going on deadly nighttime raids, the Canadians could usually be found slaughtering prisoners of war. Shockingly, in World War I, the murder of German POWs was actively encouraged by some commanders. Before the attack on Vimy Ridge, for instance, one soldier recalled how an officer told him, "Remember, no prisoners, they'll just eat your rations." Having to share already limited food supplies was just one of the reasons why most preferred to shoot rather than capture, but the most powerful justifications were revenge and battle rage. In a typical account, one lieutenant would recall how, after losing half of his company to machine gun fire, his surviving men rushed to the battery that had caused the damage to find the Germans inside crying and with their hands up. Unmoved, they proceeded to mercilessly bludgeon and shoot them to death. Another would relate on one occasion, a German rushed to one of his comrades with a bayonet, but then chickened out and surrendered. In his own words, "Our boy would have none of it. He lunged at the German again and again, who each time lowered his arms and stopped the point of the bayonet with his bare hands. The German was screaming for mercy." Even if a surrendering German somehow survived his initial encounter with a wild colonial, his life was still in great danger. In this regard, one veteran would remember how he once witnessed one of his fellow Canadians turn a German POW into red mist by dropping a live grenade into his greatcoat pocket. Live and let die. During World War I, soldiers carried out an unofficial live and let live policy. This was an unspoken agreement in which both sides agreed to only attack each other if ordered. The most famous example of this in action was the unofficial 1914 Christmas Day truce, in which thousands of combatants from both sides exchanged gifts, sang carols, and mingled with each other for a few hours. The next year, though, the Canucks were on the front lines, and unlike their allies, live and let live was not in their vocabulary. Among their number were the troops of the 3rd Battalion, who were stationed in the Ypres salient on the Western Front. In the spirit of the previous year, voices from the opposing trench wished them a happy Christmas, and some of the friendlier Canucks returned the greetings. After a couple of minutes, men from both sides had raised their heads above the dugouts, and an older, whiskered man was invitingly waving a box of cigars. Moments later, a Canadian sergeant ruined Christmas by dispatching 2 Germans with his machine gun. Of course, this wouldn't be the last time the Germans of the Great War were tricked into a false sense of security by their heartless North American foe. In one particularly cruel episode, Canuck troops tossed tins of corned beef into a German trench. Then, when they heard their requests for more, they lobbed grenades at them instead. As the stories so far have illustrated, for some reason, Canadians went absolutely bananas in World War I. But why were they so angry? Some historians have argued their ruthlessness was an emotional response to a battlefield rumor about the so-called Crucified Canadian, an officer who was supposedly crucified to a barn door near Ypres. Others have speculated their thirst for revenge drew from their traumatic experience at the harrowing 1915 Second Battle of Ypres, during which Canadians took the brunt of the first ever German poison gas attack of the war. The best explanation, however, may be the simple fact that Canadians were brutalized more than any others because they were always being placed in the first wave of attacks. Juno Beach. By the close of the Great War, the Canadians had gone from a relatively unknown fighting force to one of the planet's most feared and respected military outfits. It was with this hard-earned reputation that they would enter the killing fields of World War II to face off against a German army reinforced by elite units with a strangely familiar name, Stormtroopers. On June 6, 1944, the Canadians reminded everyone of their elite status when they pulled off what's considered one of the most tactically successful operations of D-Day. Their objective was to storm Juno Beach and then seize the cities of Caen and Bayeux with 14,000 soldiers and 1,000 paratroopers. During the first wave, 3,000 lion-hearted Canadians rushed towards German pillboxes, taking heavy casualties. They were then followed in by tanks, which obliterated most of the German beach defenses, allowing infantrymen to swarm in and begin close-quarters fighting. Impressively, it took them less than 2 hours to secure their first route off the beach at the small town of Courcelles. By the end of the day, Courcelles-sur-Mer, Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, and Colombiers-sur-Soleil had all fallen, and the tank regiment of the 1st Hussars were at the Caen-Bayeux highway intersection, making them the only Allied unit on D-Day to actually reach their final objective. The Devil's Brigade. In World War II, the Canadians distinguished themselves not only as dependable infantrymen, but also as skilled commandos in a joint American-Canadian unit called the 1st Special Service Force, better known as the Devil's Brigade, or the Black Devils. The Devil's Brigade was formed in June 1942 and had only accepted individuals into its ranks who were already well acquainted with survival and the outdoors. As a result, former skiers, parachutists, hunters, lumberjacks, trappers, and game wardens made up the majority of its personnel. These hard and rugged men were transformed into killing machines via a brutal training regime that involved 100-mile speed marches and specialist training with all sorts of weapons, explosives, and vehicles. To strike fear into their enemies' hearts on the battlefield, they placed a calling card on the dead, emblazoned with the phrase, "The worst is yet to come," in German. The Black Devils were assigned the most dangerous assignments, with one of their most iconic missions taking place in December of 1943 at the mountain peak of Monte la Defensa, southeast of Rome. For about a month, multiple British, Canadian, and American assaults attempting to dislodge the Germans at the top had been wiped out one after the other. By the time the Devil's Brigade arrived on the scene, Monte la Defensa had been battered with over 200,000 shells, earning it the nickname the $1 Million Hill. At 1:30 a.m. on December 3rd, carrying 60-pound rucksacks as well as knives, guns, and bayonets, and with charcoal-blackened faces, 600 men of the 1st Special Service Force began climbing up the near-vertical cliff face as fog and swirling snow enveloped the mountain. A little before 6 a.m., they reached the summit and began quietly slitting the throats of sentries. Then, all of a sudden, a rock slide gave away their position and the enemy opened fire. The fighting was intense and both sides suffered heavy losses, but the battle-hardened Germans were eventually expelled. In a mere 2 hours, the month-long standoff had been ended by a force that was 10 times smaller than the combined Allied force that had up until then failed to take Monte la Defensa. With a little help from the Americans, they had shown that once again, that to mess with a Canadian in wartime is to sign your own death warrant. Nazi and Japanese executions in World War II. The world may never know the full extent of the war crimes committed by the Axis powers in World War II. Documents like those pertaining to the horrific medical experiments at Unit 731, for example, have been expunged from history, hiding some of the worst atrocities that took place. But information on how they punished those they considered criminals remained. This could be anyone from political dissenters and rebels to prisoners of war and beyond. The guillotine. As medieval as the guillotine sounds, its last use was actually as recently as 1977, less than 50 years ago, in France. But as commonly associated with France as the guillotine is, it's less known that it was also prominent in other European countries. Although in use before Hitler's regime, it was in 1936 that Hitler decided that the guillotine was to be the preferred method of execution for those who received the death penalty. By 1938, all prisons were equipped with them. Hitler's chief executioner, Johann Reichardt, quickly became notorious, carrying out 3,126 guillotine death sentences from 1924 to 1945. A significant chunk of which were resistance fighters and opponents of the Nazi regime, one of which was the only American woman to be executed for treason in World War II. Mildred Fish Harnack, an American woman and wife to German Arvid Harnack, were both members of a resistance movement and spy ring dubbed the Red Orchestra by the Nazi government. Mildred faced the guillotine on February 16, 1943. But arguably the most famous uses of the guillotine was on siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl and their White Rose group. This group of Munich University students, all in their late teens and early 20s, bravely stood in nonviolent protest of Nazism. In February 1943, Sophie, Hans, and another student, the older Christopher Probst, were found guilty of disseminating leaflets against Hitler at the university. They were all sentenced to death via the guillotine and were sent to Plötzensee prison, where they were executed by the end of the same month. Their names and quiet bravery live on. Gallows. The White Rose Group were far from the only ones to die at Plötzensee prison. Many other resistance fighters and rebels endured their final moments at the prison. And it was not only the guillotine that was housed there, but gallows as well. It's another old method of execution that it seems should live in history alongside stories of pirates and medieval adventurers, not in modern-day Europe. Arvid of the Red Orchestra himself suffered the disturbing method of Nazi execution, hanged by a meat hook at the execution chamber. The Axis powers were not alone in this choice, though. The Allies also used gallows to hang spies and conspirators during the war. Other members of the Red Orchestra, including Kurt Schumacher, John Groudens, Eva Marie Buch, and Rita Arnold, were also hanged instead of beheaded in Plötzensee. Shot by firing squad. Another common method of execution was death by shooting, usually carried out by members of the Gestapo, Wehrmacht, SS, and Sturmabteilung during the Nazi regime. Many resistance fighters met their fate this way. In the Netherlands, the Nazi occupiers famously shot multiple members of the Dutch resistance. One of the most well-known is the case of Hannie Schaft, who along with other resistance fighters blew up railroads and bridges to disrupt the supply lines, among other activities such as supplying IDs for Jewish people trying to escape the Nazis. Just months from the end of the war, Hannie was arrested carrying an illegal communist newspaper. She was shot by Dutch Nazi officials in April 1945. Her last words are famously thought to have been a variation of, "I shoot better." Concentration camps. While concentration camps are of course synonymous with the Holocaust and the eradication of Jewish people, there were many others who suffered similarly horrible fates at concentration camps. Other marginalized groups like homosexual people and Romani also died, but lesser known is that Nazi resistance fighters and political prisoners of war were also among them. All of these pale in comparison, however, to some of the truly horrific and gruesome methods of execution orchestrated by other members of the Axis powers. During World War II, in the European theaters of war, of the British and American prisoners captured by Germany or Italy, 4% died in captivity. In Pacific theaters, this percentage shot all the way up to 27, more than a quarter of all captured Allied troops. Methods of torture. The Japanese were not above torturing their captives before execution as a method of punishment. Common tactics include starvation, beatings, and suspending prisoners by their arms until they were literally yanked from their sockets. From there, it only gets more disturbing with other common methods, including forcing men to kneel on sharp objects in tiny locations for long periods of time, locking them in cages, and leaving them in forced, contorted positions for literal days on end. Cannibalism. After World War II ended, it took decades for some of the most horrific Axis punishments to be brought to light, one of which was the surprising prevalence of cannibalism during the war. Historian James Bradley uncovered transcripts of downed aircraft crews during the war, including one that George W. Bush belonged to, and found that they were horrifically dissected, skinned, and eaten by the Japanese soldiers who captured them. This was done on the order of General Tachibana, who strongly believed in the descriptor "beastly" used by Imperial headquarters for the Allied troops. He wasn't alone in this, however, as other notable members of the Japanese army, such as Admiral Mori, also frequently killed and ate prisoners of war. Beheading. Before long, the policy of killing captured Allied airmen became a matter of rote. They were commonly starved and tortured before they faced the ultimate punishment of beheading. A fate of many captured prisoners of war in Japan, the practice differed from other methods such as the German preferred choice of the guillotine. One prominent example happened in August 1945, hours after the Emperor had already announced the end of the Pacific War. A group of blindfolded, captured flight crew members were taken out of the Western Army headquarters in Fukuoka, Japan, by a group of Japanese officers, including the Chief of Air Defense and Air Intelligence Unit, Colonel Yoshinao Sato. Split into smaller groups, each man was executed by beheading. The Japanese's preferred weapon of choice was a sword. On this occasion, Lieutenant Hiroji Nakayama arrived to watch the executions and was asked to carry out some himself in order to show the younger officers the correct procedure, which displays how common this method was. An expert in Bushido, the lieutenant instructed the other officers to cut a man's throat, first from the side and then the front, but crucially without severing the head completely. To do so, according to Japanese custom, was an insult to the man who died, although that probably wasn't at the top of the list of their concerns. Mutilation and dissection. One of the most horrific actions by the Japanese in World War II is arguably the brutality of mutilation and dissection that they inflicted on their captives. There are multiple accounts of prisoners of war horrifically dissected while still alive. One diary entry of a Japanese officer describes an occurrence where a medical officer named Yamaji dissected 2 prisoners, taking out their livers. The officer even calls the dissection very informative. A similar account from an eyewitness discusses a live dissection used as a medical lecture. The prisoner was tied to a tree outside the Hiarikikan office. A Japanese doctor and 4 Japanese medical students removed his fingernails and then cut open his chest and removed his heart, with which the doctor then proceeded to give a practical demonstration. Other highly graphically disturbing accounts of mutilation have been recorded, some too horrific to give in detail here, including genital mutilation, the chopping off of limbs, soles of feet, and tongues. On one occasion, a Russian officer was found with 5 stars carved in his back and a large star, hammer, and sickle on his chest, among other adornments by the Japanese. Horrific as the Axis methods of punishment during World War II were, not to mention other various atrocities committed that go against humanity and all that we consider to be basic human rights, it's imperative that they are not forgotten. We just really hope you weren't eating something while watching this video.